The mining drill's rhythmic pounding echoed across Europa's ice plains like a mechanical heartbeat, each strike sending vibrations through David Chen's boots as he stood watch over the extraction site. 3 years he'd been stationed on this frozen moon, 3 years of 14-hour shifts and recycled air, but tonight felt different. The storm warnings had been getting worse all week, and the aurora dancing across Jupiter's massive face seemed more violent than usual. "Chun, we're pulling back to base camp," crackled the voice through his comm unit. "This storm's going to be a killer." David nodded, though no one could see him through the swirling snow. The wind was already picking up, turning the falling ice crystals into tiny missiles that rattled against his environmental suit. He began the shutdown sequence for the drill, his gloved fingers working methodically through the checklist despite the growing urgency in his chest. Europa didn't forgive mistakes, and this storm looked like it could bury their entire operation under 20 feet of ice. As he sealed the drill housing, a strange sound cut through the wind, high-pitched and desperate, like nothing he'd heard in his years on the moon. David paused, tilting his head toward the sound. It came again, fainter this time, from somewhere beyond the work light's reach. His training told him to ignore it, to get back to the base camp before the storm hit full force. But something in that sound made his heart race with recognition he couldn't name. Against every regulation in the mining company handbook, David activated his suit's emergency beacon and headed toward the sound. The wind fought him with every step, trying to push him back toward safety, but he pressed forward into the darkness. His helmet lights carved weak paths through the swirling snow, revealing nothing but endless ice and rock formations sculpted by centuries of storms. Then he saw it, a dark shape huddled against a boulder, barely visible except for the faint heat signature on his thermal scanner. David's breath caught in his throat as he approached. It wasn't human. The creature was tall and slender, with skin like polished obsidian that seemed to absorb his lights rather than reflect them. But what made him stumble backward wasn't the alien appearance. It was the desperate familiarity of the scene before him. The creature was female, that much was obvious from her posture and the way she cradled something against her chest. She was nearly naked, her dark skin already showing the blue-white patches of severe frostbite. Around her feet, David could see the charred remains of fabric, clothing that had been burned in a small, pathetic fire that was already dying in the wind. The acrid smell of synthetic fibers mixed with something else, something that reminded him of cinnamon and electricity. In her arms, wrapped in what looked like the last piece of unburned clothing, was a baby. The infant was so small it could have been human, except for the same dark skin and the way its large eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light. The baby was crying. That was the sound he'd heard through the storm, a sound that spoke to something deeper than species, deeper than the vast gulf between worlds. The alien mother looked up at him with eyes like liquid silver, and David saw something that needed no translation. She was dying. The frostbite had spread too far. The cold had taken too much, but she was still trying to shield her child from the wind. Her lips moved, forming words in a language he'd never heard, but her meaning was crystal clear. She was begging him to save her baby. David's hands shook as he activated his emergency medical scanner. The readings were worse than he'd feared. The mother's core temperature was dropping toward fatal levels, and the baby wasn't much better off. He had maybe 10 minutes before hypothermia claimed them both, maybe less if the storm got worse. "Base camp. This is Chan," he spoke into his comm, knowing he was about to end his career. "I have 2 alien survivors at grid reference 77 Alpha. I need immediate medical evacuation." The silence that followed lasted forever. Then, "Chun, did you say aliens?" "David, you need to get back here now. That storm. They're dying." David cut him off, his voice steadier than he felt. "There's a mother and a baby, and they're going to die if we don't help them right now." Another pause. "Chun, you know the protocols. First contact situations require." David switched off his comm and knelt beside the alien mother, her silver eyes fixed on his face through his helmet's visor, and she said something in her liquid language that sounded like a prayer. Then, with the last of her strength, she pushed the baby toward him. The tiny creature fit perfectly in his arms, its glowing eyes staring up at him with an intelligence that made his throat tight. The mother's head fell back against the rock, and David realized she had just entrusted him with the most precious thing in her universe. David's emergency shelter deployed with a sharp hiss, its thermal generators fighting against Europa's killing cold, as he sealed himself inside with the two aliens. The mother had lost consciousness, her breathing so shallow he could barely detect it through his scanner. The baby had stopped crying but continued to stare at him with those luminous eyes, as if somehow understanding that the strange creature in the bulky suit was now all that stood between survival and the endless ice. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, drawing on 3 years of emergency medical training. The shelter's heater was already working overtime, but it would take precious minutes to bring the internal temperature up to something survivable. He activated the emergency beacon's medical priority signal, knowing it would bring questions he wasn't prepared to answer, but no longer caring about regulations or career consequences. The alien mother's physiology was similar enough to human that his medical scanner could provide basic readings, though the numbers made his stomach clench. Core temperature, 28 degrees Celsius and falling. Heart rate, erratic and weakening. Blood pressure, barely detectable. She was dying by degrees, and his standard medical kit seemed pathetically inadequate against her condition. David looked at the baby again, noting how its skin seemed to shimmer with an internal warmth that was rapidly fading. Whatever these beings were, they were clearly adapted to warmer conditions than Europa's harsh environment could provide. The mother's desperate act of burning her clothes had bought them time, but not enough. Not nearly enough. "Stay with me," he whispered to the unconscious mother, though he doubted she could hear him. "Your baby needs you to stay with me." He began working with the thermal blankets from his emergency kit, wrapping them both in layers of insulation while the shelter's heater gradually raised the temperature. The baby made soft sounds that weren't quite crying, more like musical notes that seemed to resonate in his chest. When he touched the infant's forehead with his gloved finger, it gripped him with surprising strength, those glowing eyes never leaving his face. The comm unit crackled to life despite being switched off. Emergency override from base camp. "Chun, what's your status? We're reading massive power drain from your position." "2 critical patients," David replied, his voice tight with concentration as he checked the mother's vital signs again. "Severe hypothermia, possible organ failure. I need Dr. Reyes out here with the full medical kit." "David, you can't be serious about this. They're not human. We don't know anything about their biology. Their diseases. They're dying," David snapped, surprising himself with the ferocity in his voice. "And if you won't help them, I'll figure it out myself." He cut the connection again and focused on his patients. The mother's temperature had stabilized but wasn't rising fast enough. Her skin felt like ice even through his gloves, and the frostbite damage was extensive. But it was her breathing that worried him most. Too shallow, too irregular, like her body was giving up the fight. The baby, however, seemed to be responding to the warmth. Its skin was gradually regaining that internal shimmer, and the crying had stopped entirely. When David offered it a sip of glucose solution from his medical kit, the infant accepted it eagerly, making those same musical sounds that tugged at something deep in his chest. "Your mama's a fighter," he told the baby, surprised by how natural it felt to talk to the alien child. "She burned everything she had to keep you warm. That's love, little one. That's what love looks like." As if responding to his voice, the baby reached out with one tiny hand and touched his helmet. For a moment, David could have sworn he felt warmth spread through the plasteel, impossible as that seemed. The infant's eyes seemed to grow brighter, and it made a sound that was unmistakably pleased. The shelter's proximity alarm chimed, indicating approaching vehicles. David looked through the transparent aluminum window and saw the base camp's emergency medical transport cutting through the storm, its lights carving bright paths through the swirling snow. Behind it came another vehicle, the command transport, which meant Commander Walsh was coming personally to assess the situation. David's stomach clenched. Walsh was career military, a by-the-book administrator who'd made it clear that Europa Mining Station existed to extract resources, not play host to interspecies incidents. The man had no patience for complications, and 2 dying aliens definitely qualified as complications. As the vehicles approached, David made a decision that would change everything. He sealed his helmet and activated his suit's external speakers, then gently lifted the baby while keeping one hand on the mother's chest to monitor her breathing. "Listen to me," he said to the unconscious alien woman, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but I'm going to make you a promise. Your baby is going to survive this. Whatever it takes, whoever I have to fight, your child is going to live. That's a human promise, and we don't break those lightly." The baby made that musical sound again, and David could have sworn it was responding to his words. Outside, the vehicles were deploying their landing gear, and he could see figures in environmental suits preparing to enter his shelter. The real test was about to begin. Commander Walsh filled the medical bay with his presence like a storm front. His weathered face set in the hard lines David had learned to recognize as barely controlled anger. Dr. Elena Reyes worked silently over the alien mother, her hands steady despite the tension crackling through the room like static electricity. The baby lay in a makeshift incubator, its skin gradually warming to that inner shimmer that seemed to pulse with its heartbeat. "Explain to me, Chun, how a routine equipment check turned into a first contact scenario," Walsh said, his voice carefully modulated to just below a shout. "Explain to me why I have 2 unidentified alien life forms in my medical bay, and why you decided to play interspecies rescue worker without authorization." David kept his eyes on the baby, watching the rise and fall of its tiny chest. "They were dying, sir. The mother had burned her clothes to keep her child warm. I couldn't just walk away." "You could have, and you should have," Walsh snapped. "We have protocols, Chin. First contact procedures that exist for very good reasons. You've potentially exposed this entire station to unknown pathogens, unknown technologies, unknown political ramifications that could—" "Commander," Dr. Reyes interrupted without looking up from her patient. "Whatever your concerns about protocol, this woman is going to die if we don't focus on treating her rather than debating how she got here." Walsh's jaw tightened, but he fell silent as Reyes continued her work. David had served with the doctor for 2 years and had never heard her speak to Walsh with such quiet authority. She was a small woman with graying hair and hands that never seemed to shake, no matter how critical the situation. Right now, those hands were the only thing standing between the alien mother and death. "Her physiology is remarkably similar to human," Reyes murmured, more to herself than to the others. "Cardiovascular system, respiratory function, even brain activity patterns. It's like looking at a variation on our own species rather than something truly alien." She paused, studying a readout on her scanner. "But there are differences. Her body temperature should be running about 4 degrees higher than human normal, and her metabolism is designed for a much more oxygen-rich atmosphere." "Can you save her?" David asked, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "I think so. The hypothermia did significant damage, but if her system responds to human treatment protocols." Reyes trailed off, adjusting the settings on the warming unit. "She's fighting. Whatever else she is, she's a fighter." The baby made one of its musical sounds, and David found himself moving closer to the incubator. The infant's eyes tracked his movement with obvious intelligence, and when he placed his hand against the transparent aluminum, the baby pressed its own tiny palm against the same spot from the inside. The contact sent warmth spreading up David's arm. Not physical warmth, but something deeper, more fundamental. "They're bonding," Dr. Reyes observed, glancing between David and the baby. "Fascinating. Cross-species parental imprinting isn't unheard of in Earth mammals, but I've never seen it happen this quickly or this completely." "What does that mean?" Walsh demanded. "It means," Reyes said carefully, "that this infant has identified David as a primary caregiver. Given that its mother is unconscious and possibly dying, that psychological connection might be the only thing keeping it stable right now." David stared down at the baby, feeling something shift inside his chest like tectonic plates settling into a new configuration. The infant's eyes were so expressive, so aware, that it was impossible to think of it as just an alien specimen. This was someone's child, someone who had sacrificed everything to keep it alive. "Sir, came a voice from the communication station. "We're receiving a transmission. It's unusual." Walsh strode over to the comm operator, David close behind. The transmission was unlike anything they'd heard before. Not radio waves or laser communication, but something that seemed to bypass their equipment entirely and resonate directly in their bones. It was hauntingly beautiful, like whale song mixed with crystal chimes. But underneath the beauty was unmistakable desperation. "Can you translate it?" Walsh asked the linguistics AI. "Working," the artificial voice replied. "Language pattern suggests high emotional content. Multiple speakers, possibly distressed. Attempting semantic analysis." The transmission continued, growing more urgent, and David felt the baby's distress before he heard it crying. The infant was responding to the sounds, its luminous eyes wide with what looked like recognition and fear. "Translation partial," the AI announced. Key phrases identified: "Lost child," "Search pattern 7," "ZAR designation not responding," and "Dying world protocol initiated." The room fell silent except for the baby's crying and the steady beep of the alien mother's life support systems. David felt the weight of realization settling over him like Europa's crushing gravity. "They're looking for them," he said quietly. "A whole ship, maybe a whole fleet, looking for this mother and her baby. Which means," Walsh said grimly, "that we're about to have a lot more than 2 aliens to worry about." As if summoned by his words, the proximity alarms began wailing throughout the station. On the main display, dozens of new contacts were appearing at the edge of their sensor range, moving toward Europa with purpose and speed. The rescue had become something much larger and more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The alien ships appeared on Europa's horizon like silver tears against Jupiter's gas giant backdrop, their hulls reflecting the aurora in patterns that seemed too beautiful to belong to vessels of war. David watched them approach through the observation deck's reinforced windows, his heart hammering against his ribs as he counted at least 30 ships in formation. Each one was roughly the size of Europa Station's main habitat, sleek and organic-looking, as if they'd been grown rather than built. Behind him, the command center buzzed with barely controlled panic. Walsh was barking orders to security teams while the communications array worked overtime trying to establish contact with the approaching fleet. But David's attention was split between the alien armada and the baby in his arms, the infant he'd been carrying almost constantly since its mother had fallen into a deeper coma 3 hours ago. "The lead ship is requesting docking permission," announced Lieutenant Torres from the communication station. "They're using our own language now, sir. Perfect English." "How the hell do they know English?" Walsh demanded. Dr. Reyes looked up from her patient monitoring station. "From her," she said quietly, indicating the unconscious alien mother. "While we've been studying her biology, she's been unconsciously broadcasting. These beings appear to have some form of telepathic or empathic connection. She's been sharing our language, our memories, everything she's absorbed from being around us." The baby in David's arms made a soft cooing sound and reached toward the windows where the ships continued their approach. Its glowing eyes seemed brighter now, almost eager, and David felt a strange mixture of relief and loss. Soon, the infant would be returned to its own people, which was what needed to happen. But the thought of letting go sent an unexpected ache through his chest. "Commander Walsh," came a new voice over the comm system, this one deep and resonant with what sounded like barely contained grief. "I am Kethvar, first seeker of the wandering fleet. We have come for our lost ones." Walsh straightened, his military bearing taking over despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "This is Commander Walsh of Europa Mining Station. We have provided medical assistance to 2 of your people who were found in critical condition on our moon's surface." A pause that seemed to stretch forever. Then, "We are grateful beyond words, human friend. The one you call Mother is Zara, keeper of sacred songs for our people. The small one is her offspring, Lithanael, born as our world died. They were lost when their escape pod malfunctioned during the Great Departure." David felt his throat tighten. "Their world died," he whispered. Dr. Reyes had gone pale. "David, what if they're not just refugees? What if they're the last of their kind? The implications hit him like a physical blow. The baby in his arms wasn't just someone's child. It might be one of the last children of an entire civilization. The mother who had burned her clothes to keep it warm might have been protecting not just her offspring, but the future of her entire species. "First Seeker Kethvar," Walsh said into the calm, his voice gentler now. "Your people are welcome here. We'll prepare docking Bay 7 for your ship." "Only one vessel will dock," came the reply. "The others must continue the search for other survivors. But first, I must ask, do our lost ones live?" David stepped forward before Walsh could answer. "The baby is healthy and safe," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The mother, she's alive, but her condition is critical. She sacrificed everything to save her child." The silence that followed was profound, filled with an emotional weight that seemed to press against David's consciousness like a physical presence. When Kethvar spoke again, his voice carried the weight of entire worlds. "Zara always carried the songs of our people in her heart," he said. "Even as our son died and our cities fell silent, she sang the old melodies to keep hope alive, that she would burn her ceremonial robes to warm her child. This is the greatest love song of all." Through the observation windows, David watched as one of the alien ships broke formation and approached the station. It moved with impossible grace, like a dancer made of starlight and metal. As it drew closer, he could see intricate patterns carved into its hull, symbols that seemed to shift and flow even as he watched them. The baby in his arms began to make those musical sounds again, but this time they were different. These weren't cries of distress or contentment, but something that sounded almost like singing. The infant's eyes were fixed on the approaching ship, and David realized it somehow knew it was going home. "Sir," Torres called out, excitement and worry warring in his voice, "I'm picking up biological readings from the alien ship. There are thousands of life signs aboard that vessel alone. This isn't just a rescue mission. They're carrying entire populations." David felt the weight of history settling around them. They weren't just witnessing first contact anymore. They were caught in the middle of an exodus that spanned star systems. The baby in his arms represented not just one family's desperate escape, but the hope of an entire civilization that had watched their world die. As the alien ship settled into Europa Station's docking bay with a grace that defied physics, David knew that nothing would ever be the same. Not for him, not for the mining station, and not for humanity itself. The universe had just become a much larger and more tragic place. The docking bay filled with an ethereal harmony as Kethvar emerged from his ship, accompanied by a group of beings whose presence seemed to make the very air shimmer with music. They were tall and elegant like Zara, but their skin held different hues, deep purples, rich blues, and one whose obsidian surface seemed to contain entire galaxies. Each step they took produced a subtle resonance that David felt in his bones, as if their very existence was tuned to frequencies humans had never imagined. Kethvar himself stood nearly 7 feet tall, his silver skin marked with intricate patterns that pulsed with soft light. When his eyes, larger and more luminous than even the baby's, fixed on David, the human felt as though he was being seen not just physically, but down to the core of his soul. "You are the one who found them," Kethvar said, and his voice carried harmonics that made David's chest vibrate with emotion. "You are David Chun, who heard Lithanael's first song and chose to answer." David shifted the baby in his arms, suddenly aware of how small and fragile the infant looked compared to these magnificent beings. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he said quietly. "No," Kethvar replied, stepping closer. The other aliens formed a loose circle around them, their presence both protective and reverent. "We have traveled between stars for generations, and we know the hearts of many species. What you did was not instinct or duty. It was a choice that came from the deepest place within you. You chose to love when love made no sense." The baby, Lithanael, made those musical sounds again, but now David could hear the response from the other aliens. They were singing together, a song that seemed to celebrate not just reunion, but recognition of something sacred. Dr. Reyes approached from the medical bay, her expression a mixture of wonder and professional concern. "First Seeker," she said formally, "your people's physiology is remarkable. Zara is responding to treatment, but she needs specialized care that I'm not equipped to provide. Her system is designed for atmospheric conditions and energy patterns that simply don't exist on Europa." Kethvar's luminous eyes dimmed with sorrow. "Our ship carries the healing songs of our world, but—" He paused, looking at David with an expression that seemed to weigh the entire universe. "There is something you must understand about what has happened here. Zara didn't just burn her ceremonial robes to warm Lithanael. Those robes contained the genetic memory of our people, living threads that carried the songs, stories, and biological templates of our entire civilization." David felt his blood turn to ice. "You mean she destroyed the last physical link to our world," Kethvar confirmed. "In saving her child, she erased the possibility of rebuilding what we lost. It was the ultimate sacrifice, trading our past for Lithanael's future." The weight of that revelation settled over David like Europa's crushing gravity. The woman lying unconscious in their medical bay hadn't just been a desperate mother. She'd been the keeper of an entire culture's legacy, and she'd chosen to burn it all to keep her baby alive for one more hour. "But there's more," Kethvar continued, his voice growing softer, more musical. "In those final moments before her consciousness faded, Zara did something unprecedented. She sang the memory songs not into the fabric of her robes, but into the mind of the human who chose to save her child. David Chun, you now carry within you the last traces of our world's song." David stared at the alien leader, feeling a strange resonance in his chest that he'd attributed to stress and exhaustion. "That's impossible. I don't know your language, your culture, your—" "Close your eyes," Kethvar said gently. "Listen not with your ears, but with the place inside you that knew to save a crying child in a snowstorm." David closed his eyes and immediately felt it, a warmth spreading through his consciousness like sunrise. Images flashed behind his eyelids. Vast crystal cities reaching toward twin suns, beings like Kethvar and Zara singing in harmony as they tended gardens that grew songs instead of flowers, children learning to speak by weaving melodies into the air itself. And threaded through it all, a voice that he recognized as Zara's, singing lullabies that carried the weight of entire worlds. When he opened his eyes, tears were streaming down his face. "I can hear it," he whispered. "I can hear her singing." Lithanael reached up with one tiny hand and touched David's cheek, and suddenly the baby's musical sounds transformed into something David could understand. The infant was asking for his mother, but also expressing gratitude, love, and an acceptance that seemed far too mature for someone so young. "This creates a problem," Dr. Reyes said quietly, though David could hear the wonder in her voice. "If David is now carrying part of their cultural memory, what does that mean for both species?" Kethvar's patterns pulsed with what David somehow knew was profound consideration. "It means," the first seeker said finally, "that the song of our people will continue, even if we cannot. It means that Zara's sacrifice was not the end of our world, but the beginning of something new, something unprecedented." Commander Walsh, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward. "First Seeker, what are you asking of us?" Kethvar looked at David, then at the baby in his arms, then at the assembled humans who had risked everything to save two strangers from the ice. "I am asking," he said, "if you would help us raise the last songs of a dying world into something that might yet sing among the stars." The future hung in that moment like a note held between breaths, waiting to resolve into harmony or discord. 6 months later, David stood in the converted observatory that had become Europa Station's most unusual classroom, watching Lithanael take their first tentative steps while humming a melody that made the station's metal walls resonate like a vast instrument. The baby had grown quickly, their luminous eyes now bright with intelligence and mischief, their tiny hands already learning to shape the air into patterns of light and sound that defied human understanding. Zara sat nearby, her recovery nothing short of miraculous once Kethvar's healers had arrived with their song medicines and harmonic treatments. She was still weak, but the silver in her eyes had returned to its full brilliance, and when she sang, which was often, the entire station seemed to listen. Her voice carried stories of worlds that no longer existed, of love that transcended species, of hope that refused to die even when everything else had been lost. The little one speaks 3 languages now, Dr. Reyes observed, entering the observatory with her daily medical readings. Human English, their people's harmonic tongue, and something entirely new that seems to be a fusion of both. David, when you hold them, I can actually measure the linguistic patterns forming in real time. David smiled, feeling the warm weight of responsibility and joy that had become as natural as breathing. The strange resonance in his chest had never faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, evolving into a constant awareness of melodies and memories that belonged to a civilization he'd never seen but somehow understood completely. Kethvar says the new language is what happens when a dying song learns to hope again, David replied, gently lifting Lithanael as the toddler wandered toward the large viewport showing Jupiter's eternal storm. The elders are calling it the bridge tongue, a way for different species to share not just words, but the emotions and memories behind them. Commander Walsh entered, his expression a mixture of pride and bewilderment that had become his default setting since Europa Station had transformed from a simple mining outpost into humanity's first interspecies cultural center. Behind him came 3 figures that made David's heart swell with complicated joy. His parents and sister, who had traveled from Earth specifically to meet their new grandchild and niece. The Council's decision came through, Walsh announced. Europa Station has been officially designated as humanity's first interspecies heritage preserve. We're getting funding for a full cultural exchange program, permanent diplomatic facilities, and... He paused, looking directly at David. A formal adoption protocol for cross-species families. David felt Zara's hand slip into his free one, her touch carrying harmonics of gratitude that needed no translation. Over the past months, as he'd helped care for Lithanael and learned to access the cultural memories Zara had sung into his consciousness, something beautiful and unprecedented had emerged. They weren't lovers in any conventional sense. The physiological differences made that impossible, but they had become something deeper. A family bound not by biology but by choice, sacrifice, and love that transcended the boundaries of species. Papa David, Lithanael said clearly, their voice carrying the musical undertones of their mother's people but shaped by human phonetics. Sing the Earth Song. David laughed, settling the toddler more comfortably in his arms. Over the months, he discovered that the bridge tongue allowed him to share human memories and emotions through melody, just as Zara shared her people's cultural heritage. Lithanael's favorite was his memory of Earth's oceans, vast bodies of water that sang their own ancient songs. As David began to hum a lullaby his own mother had sung to him decades ago, weaving into it the taste of salt air and the sound of waves against shore, he felt the observatory fill with an impossible harmony. Zara added her voice, carrying melodies from crystal cities under twin suns. Lithanael contributed their own wordless song that seemed to bridge the gap between worlds. And gradually, other voices joined them. Dr. Reyes, Commander Walsh, even David's family, who didn't understand the science but recognized the love. Through the viewport, David could see other ships arriving at Europa Station's expanded docking facilities. Some carried more refugees from Zara's people, survivors who had heard about the impossible sanctuary where songs could be preserved and hope could be rebuilt. Others brought human researchers, diplomats, and families who wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. But what made David's heart soar was the sight of the newest arrivals. Ships from a dozen different species who had heard the bridge tongue being broadcast across the galaxy and had come to learn how love could transcend the boundaries of biology, culture, and even extinction itself. Mama Zara, Lithanael said, reaching for their birth mother while remaining secure in David's arms. Tell the star story. Zara's eyes brightened as she began to sing the ancient tale of how her people first learned to travel between worlds by listening to the songs that stars sang to each other across the void. But as she sang, David felt the story changing, evolving, incorporating new verses about frozen moons and human kindness, about families that chose each other across species lines, about love that burned bright enough to warm a child even when everything else was lost. As the three of them sang together in the converted observatory, surrounded by the impossible beauty of Jupiter's aurora and the growing community of beings who had found in each other something worth preserving, David realized they had created something unprecedented. Not just first contact, but first harmony. A song that proved love was indeed the universal language, one that could be learned by any species willing to listen with their hearts. The music swelled, carrying their voices out into the void where other worlds waited to learn that in a universe vast and often cold, warmth could still be found in the simple act of choosing to care for each other's children. The song continued, and would continue, long after the last star burned out. The concert hall that had once been Europa Station's largest cargo bay thrummed with anticipation as beings from 17 different worlds took their seats, or settled into the specialized atmospheric pods that allowed methane breathers and silicon-based life forms to participate. David adjusted his formal translator collar, a beautiful device woven from both human technology and the living crystal fibers that Zara's people used to store memory. Tonight would mark the 5th anniversary of what historians were already calling the Great Convergence, and the first public performance of the Symphony of Worlds. Backstage, if the converted storage area behind the performance space could be called that, Lyth and Ael practiced their scales with the intense concentration of a 5-year-old who understood they were about to make history. Their voice had developed into something extraordinary. Not just the harmonic abilities of their birth species or the linguistic flexibility they'd learned from humans, but something entirely new. When Lyth and Ael sang, reality itself seemed to listen and respond. "Are you nervous, little star?" Zara asked, kneeling beside her child and adjusting the ceremonial robes they wore. New ones, woven from the memory threads that 17 civilizations had contributed to replace what she had burned in desperation 5 years ago. Lyth and Ael considered the question with the gravity that had become their trademark. "Not nervous, Mama Zara. Excited. Tonight we sing the universe into remembering how to love." David felt his heart clench with pride and wonder as he always did when Lyth and Ael spoke. The child had grown into something unprecedented. A bridge between worlds not just linguistically, but spiritually. They carried the cultural memories of Zara's people, the emotional resonance David had shared through their bond, and something uniquely their own that seemed to draw the best from every species they encountered. Places, everyone, called Dr. Reyes, who had somehow evolved from the station's chief medical officer into its director of interspecies cultural affairs. The Galactic Council representatives are taking their seats, and were broadcasting to 700 worlds across 3 galactic sectors. Through the transparent aluminum wall that separated the backstage area from the concert hall, David could see the assembled audience that would have been impossible to imagine 5 years ago. The Zephyrians, with their gossamer wings that caught and refracted light into impossible colors. The Lithonic Collective, whose crystalline forms resonated with harmonic frequencies that could shatter stone or heal broken hearts depending on their intent. The newly contacted Verdants, plant-based beings whose root systems had learned to communicate through soil chemistry and whose attendance required specially prepared biosubstrates. But it was the humans scattered throughout the audience that made David's chest tight with emotion. Families who had traveled from across Earth's solar system to witness this moment. Children who had grown up hearing stories of the alien mother who burned her clothes to save her baby. Scientists and artists and ordinary people who had come to understand that the universe was far stranger and more beautiful than they'd ever imagined. Commander Walsh, now Admiral Walsh, though he'd never quite gotten comfortable with the promotion, took the stage to address the assembled beings. His presence had evolved over the years from barely controlled military tension to something resembling paternal pride as he'd watched Europa Station grow from a mining outpost into the cultural heart of an emerging galactic community. 5 years ago, Walsh began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's advanced translation systems. A human mining engineer made a choice to save 2 strangers from a storm. Tonight, we celebrate not just that choice, but what it has grown into, proof that love, sacrifice, and hope are not limited to any single species, but are the fundamental forces that bind all conscious life together. The audience's response was extraordinary. Not applause in the human sense, but a symphony of sounds that each species used to express joy and appreciation. The Zephyrians created aurora-like displays with their wings. The Lithonic Collective rang like cathedral bells, and the Verdance released pheromones that smelled like spring mornings on a dozen different worlds. Zara took the stage first, her silver skin now bearing new patterns that had emerged as her people's culture adapted to its new reality. She began with the Song of Remembrance, a haunting melody that carried the weight of their lost world, while celebrating the new home they'd found among the stars. Her voice filled the hall with images of crystal cities and twin suns, but also with new verses about ice moons and metal corridors, about the kindness of strangers and the family that chose each other across the void. When David joined her on stage, the bridge tongue that they developed together transformed the performance into something unprecedented. Human emotions, love, loss, hope, determination, wove seamlessly with the harmonic memories of Zara's people, creating a musical narrative that spoke directly to the souls of every being present regardless of their biological origins. But it was when Lithanael took center stage that the real magic began. Now 5 years old and radiant with confidence, they began to sing not just in the bridge tongue, but in a new language that incorporated elements from every species present. The Symphony of Worlds wasn't just a performance. It was an active demonstration of what was possible when different forms of consciousness chose to harmonize rather than compete. As Lithanael's voice soared through melodies that seemed to rewrite the laws of physics, David felt the familiar warmth in his chest expand into something cosmic. Through the memory songs that Zara had shared with him, he could perceive the music not just as sound but as living energy that connected every conscious being in the hall to every other. The Zephyrians began to glow, their wing patterns shifting to match the musical phrases. The Lithonic collective resonated in perfect harmony, their crystalline structures becoming living instruments. The Verdance released clouds of bioluminescent spores that danced in the air like visible music. And the humans, tears streaming down faces raised toward the impossible beauty of Lithanael's voice, found themselves singing along in languages they'd never learned but somehow understood. This was what they had built together over 5 years of patient work, cultural exchange, and the daily choice to see difference as opportunity rather than threat. Not just first contact, but first harmony. Not just communication between species, but communion. As the symphony reached its crescendo, Lithanael's voice carried a new verse that made David's heart soar with recognition. They were singing about the future, about children yet to be born who would grow up in a universe where love transcended biology, where families could form across species lines, where the burning sacrifice of one mother on a frozen moon had sparked a fire that would warm the galaxy for generations to come. The performance ended not with applause, but with silence, the profound quiet of 17 species holding their breath in shared awe. Then, slowly, the hall filled with something David had never heard before. Every being present singing the same melody in their own way, creating a harmony that seemed to make the space itself vibrate with joy. Later, as the audience dispersed to continue their conversations in the station's expanded cultural quarters, David found himself alone with his family in the observation deck that had become their private sanctuary. Lithanael slept peacefully in his arms, exhausted by the evening's performance but smiling even in sleep. Zara sat beside them, her patterns pulsing softly with contentment as she watched Jupiter's eternal storm through the transparent aluminum. "What are you thinking about?" David asked softly, careful not to wake the child. Zara was quiet for a long moment, then began to hum a melody he'd never heard before. Something new, something that carried the weight of 5 years of love and growth and impossible possibilities made real. "I am thinking," she said finally, "about the choice you made in that storm, how a moment of compassion became a song that spans star systems. How burning everything I had to save one small life somehow saved all of us." David shifted Lithanael to a more comfortable position, marveling as he always did at how perfectly the child fit in his arms despite the biological impossibility of their relationship. "Do you ever regret it? Losing your world's memory threads? Your people's history?" "Never," Zara replied immediately, her voice carrying harmonics of absolute certainty. "History is what was. The threads I burned contained our past, but what we built here, what we continue to build, this is our future. This is what love looks like when it refuses to accept extinction as the end of the story." Through the observation deck's windows, They could see other ships arriving at Europa Station's docking bays. The stream of visitors had never stopped. Refugees seeking sanctuary, scientists studying the phenomenon of cross-species cultural integration, artists hoping to learn new forms of expression, and families like their own who had discovered that love could transcend any boundary the universe tried to impose. But tonight's arrivals were special. These were the ships carrying the first generation of children born after the Great Convergence, beings who had grown up in the new reality that Lithanael's existence had made possible. Human children who spoke in harmonies, Zephyrian youth whose wing patterns told stories in the bridge tongue, young lithonic crystals that had learned to sing lullabies, verdant saplings whose root networks carried poetry between star systems. Papa David, Lithanael murmured sleepily, their eyes opening to focus on the approaching ships. Are those the new friends coming to learn our songs? Yes, little star, David replied, his voice thick with emotion. Children from across the galaxy who want to learn how to build bridges between worlds. Lithanael smiled and began to hum softly. Not one of the ancient songs of their heritage or the familiar melodies of Earth, but something entirely new. A song that carried the promise of tomorrow, the certainty that love could overcome any obstacle, and the joy of a child who had never known a universe where difference was something to fear rather than celebrate. As their small family sat together watching the future arrive one ship at a time, David understood that Zara's sacrifice in that storm had been more than a mother saving her child. It had been the universe itself learning a new song, one that would echo between the stars long after their own voices had joined the cosmic harmony that connected all things. The music continued, and would continue, carrying the simple truth that love was indeed the most powerful force in existence, strong enough to warm a freezing child, bridge the gap between species, and transform a mining station on a frozen moon into the beating heart of an entirely new form of civilization. Outside, Jupiter's aurora danced in patterns that seemed almost like music made visible, as if the giant planet itself was singing along with the impossible family that had chosen each other across the void and built a home among the stars. 3 weeks after the Symphony of Worlds concert, David was conducting his morning rounds of the station's new cultural preservation wing when the emergency alert chimed through Europa Station's communication system. But this wasn't the sharp, urgent tone of a mechanical crisis or incoming storm. This was something softer, more musical, that made every being on the station pause and listen. David to the communications center, Priority 1. Came Dr. Rhea's voice, but underneath her words was an undercurrent of wonder that made his pulse quicken. He found the communication center buzzing with controlled excitement. Representatives from 7 different species crowded around the main display, their various forms of expression, wing patterns, harmonic resonances, bioluminescent pulses, all indicating the same thing. Something extraordinary was happening. What is it? David asked, settling Lithanael on his hip. The 5-year-old had insisted on coming along, claiming they could feel the new song in the air. Long-range sensors picked this up about an hour ago, Dr. Reyes explained, gesturing to the display that showed wave patterns unlike anything David had seen before. It's a transmission, but not like any we've encountered. It's coming from beyond the galactic rim, from empty space where there shouldn't be anything capable of generating signals. Kethvar stepped forward, his silver skin patterns pulsing with recognition and something that looked like desperate hope. "Play it again," he requested softly. The communication center filled with sound that was both alien and achingly familiar. A harmony of voices singing in languages that spanned the spectrum of consciousness. But woven through the melody were phrases David recognized. Words in the bridge tongue that Lithanael had helped create. Musical patterns that carried the memory of Zara's people and the warmth of human compassion. "Mama Zara," Lithanael whispered, their luminous eyes wide with recognition. "It's the lost songs, the ones you thought were gone forever." Zara materialized beside them, her movement fluid despite the fact that she'd been in the hydroponics bay teaching verdant saplings how to grow musical fruit trees. Her face was radiant with an emotion David had never seen before. A mixture of joy and disbelief so profound it made her entire being shimmer like starlight. "It's impossible," she breathed, but her voice carried harmonics of absolute certainty. Those are the deep memory songs, the ones that were lost when our world died. But they're different now. They've grown, evolved, incorporated new melodies that shouldn't exist. The transmission continued, and gradually David began to understand what they were hearing. It wasn't just a recording of lost songs. It was a living composition that somehow incorporated every act of love, sacrifice, and hope that had occurred since Zara had burned her robes in that storm 5 years ago. The music carried echoes of Nathaniel's first words, the moment David had chosen to save strangers from the ice, the symphony they'd performed 3 weeks ago, and countless other instances of beings choosing connection over isolation. Computer, analyze transmission source and trajectory, Admiral Walsh commanded, his military bearing intact despite the tears streaming down his weathered face. Transmission originates from coordinates indicating the galactic void. The AI responded. However, trajectory analysis suggests the signal has been traveling for approximately 3,000 years, predating known civilization in that region by several millennia. A profound silence fell over the communication center as the implications sank in. This wasn't a message from the present. It was an echo from the past, or perhaps a promise from the future, carrying songs that had somehow transcended the death of worlds and the passage of eons. Nathaniel slipped from David's arms and approached the main display, their small hands pressed against the control panel as if they could touch the music itself. "It's not from the past," they said with the matter-of-fact certainty that always surprised the adults around them. "It's from all the times that love wins. Every time someone chooses to save a stranger, every time a mother sacrifices for her child, every time people who are different decide to sing together instead of fight, it makes the song stronger." The transmission began to shift, and suddenly David could hear his own voice woven into the harmony. Not words he'd spoken, but the emotional resonance of every moment he'd spent caring for Nathaniel, learning from Zara, building bridges between species. His memories of holding a crying alien baby in a storm had somehow become part of a cosmic symphony that spanned space and time. "The songs never die," Zara said softly, her silver eyes reflecting the dancing patterns on the display. "They grow, they change, they find new voices to carry them forward. What I burned to save Nathaniel wasn't destroyed. It was planted, like seeds in fertile ground, and now it's blooming across the galaxy." As if responding to her words, the transmission crescendoed into something that made every being in the communication center catch their breath. It was the sound of the universe singing to itself. Every act of compassion, every choice to love instead of fear, every bridge built between different forms of consciousness, all woven together into a melody that seemed to rewrite the fundamental laws of existence. "This is bigger than first contact," Admiral Walsh said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "This is proof that consciousness itself, love itself, is a force that transcends physics, that connects every thinking being across time and space." The transmission ended as gently as it had begun, leaving the communication center filled with the kind of silence that follows revelation. But David could feel it continuing in his chest, in the warm resonance that had become as natural as his heartbeat. The music was part of him now, part of all of them, a constant reminder that every choice to love made the universe a little more harmonious. "What do we do now?" Dr. Reyes asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Nathaniel looked up at the assembled beings, human, alien, and everything in between, with eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had never known a universe where love was limited by biology or bordered by species. "We keep singing," they said simply. "We teach the new songs to everyone who wants to learn. We make sure that nobody ever has to burn their last hope to keep love alive." As the group began to disperse, each carrying the weight and wonder of what they'd experienced, David felt Zara's hand slip into his. Together, they watched their child begin to hum a new melody, something that incorporated the cosmic transmission they just heard, the daily sounds of Europa Station's multicultural community, and the endless possibilities of a universe where love truly was the strongest force of all. The song continued, and would continue, echoing between the stars until the last conscious being chose compassion over indifference, hope over despair, and love over the infinite cold of space.